The morning my son abandoned me, it was already hot by 9 o'clock. Not the slow kind of heat that builds through the day. The kind that arrives sharp and settled, like it has been there all along and you were only just permitted to notice it. I was sitting on a metal bench, outside a Denny's on Sunrise Boulevard in Sacramento. A brown leather suitcase between my knees, and $40 folded into my shirt pocket like a tip, left on a table after a bad meal. My son Garrett had been gone for 11 minutes. I know because I had looked at my watch when the Tahoe pulled out of the lot, and I had looked again when the sound of the engine finally disappeared into traffic. 11 minutes. The whole thing had taken less time than a cup of coffee. He had not said happy birthday. He had not said goodbye. He had looked at his phone, then at the road, and said the words in the flat, rehearsed tone of a man who has been practicing them in the car on the way over. Pop, Heather and I talked it over. The kids need their own rooms. We can't keep doing this. And then he had driven away. I sat on that bench and waited for shame to finish with me. The breakfast crowd came and went. Families carried takeout boxes toward minivans. A couple stood near the entrance laughing about something on one of their phones. A man in a blue work shirt held the door open for his wife the way I had always held it for Eleanor. One hand on the frame, one step back, eyes still on her face. I had done that for 31 years. I still sometimes reach for a door and turn to look for a woman who had been gone for 6. I kept my suitcase between my feet like someone might want it, though there was nothing inside worth taking. 3 pairs of pants, 4 shirts, a razor, my blood pressure pills, and Eleanor's photograph in the inside pocket, wrapped in the piece of linen she had used to press wildflowers when our son was small. Around noon, the waitress who had wished me happy birthday when I had first sat down came outside. "Her name tag," said Marlene. She looked at my case, then at my face, and asked gently if I was waiting for someone. "Yes, ma'am," I said, "just waiting on a ride." She nodded the way people do when they know better, and have decided not to make it worse. 10 minutes later, she came back with a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie wrapped in a napkin. "Happy birthday again," she said. That was when I almost broke. I want you to understand what it means to be left like that. Not by a stranger, not by someone indifferent, by your son. The child whose mortgage you helped pay for 3 consecutive years when his contracting business went soft and he could barely make payroll. The child who called you every Sunday night. Always starting with "How are you?" and ending with "just a little short this month." The child who looked you in the eye when his second daughter was coming and said, "Pop, your family, you don't pay rent to family." So I had given up my apartment off Florin Road, the place that still smelled faintly like Eleanor because I had kept her things too long. I had sold my pickup because Garrett said there was no room in the driveway. I had let go of the old workbench I had hauled through 4 moves since 1987. A scarred wooden thing that had outlasted 2 marriages in the neighborhood and a house fire 2 streets over because there was no room in the garage. For 3 years and 4 months, I had cooked breakfast, watched the girls after school, fixed whatever broke, and stayed out of rooms where I was not wanted. I thought I was holding something together. I thought I was being useful in a way that would matter. What I had actually been doing was making it easier for them to eventually remove me. Because that is what happens when you allow yourself to become furniture. Useful, quiet, and easy to carry out when the room needs changing. By 2 o'clock, the sun had moved around the building and found my face directly. The coffee Marlene had brought me was cold. The pie was half-eaten and stuck to its napkin from the heat. My back was aching from the metal bench. My left knee had stiffened the way it does when I have been still too long. I reached into my shirt pocket and looked at the $40. 2 20s. folded together like Garrett had thought about it, like the neatness of the fold was supposed to mean something, not enough for a motel, barely enough for groceries and a bus ride if I was careful. There was no apartment to go back to, no spare key under a porch somewhere, no truck, no workbench. The life I had before his house was gone because I had given it away piece by piece in exchange for the word family, and that word had just driven off in a Tahoe. I put the money back. Then I heard myself whisper something I had not said out loud since Eleanor died. "Get up, Harlan?" So I did. My knee popped. I took the suitcase handle. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and looked across the parking lot. There was a bus stop at the corner. One cracked bench, one faded route sign, a strip of shade that barely covered half the sidewalk. I started walking toward it. I did not know where the bus went. I only knew I could not let that bench outside a Denny's become the place where my story decided it was finished. The bus stop corner was quiet, the way certain Sacramento corners get in the early afternoon, when the heat has emptied the sidewalk of anyone who had a better option. I sat down with my suitcase and checked my flip phone. 2 bars of battery, no missed calls, no text from Garrett with the address of that senior living facility on Watt Avenue he had mentioned in passing 2 weeks ago, the one time he had bothered to suggest there might be a plan. Across the street, under the awning of a closed pharmacy, an older man sat alone. He was tall even sitting down, wearing a tan windbreaker and a gray driving cap that had the soft, settled look of something worn every day for years. A white cane rested across his knees. His face was weathered but calm, the specific stillness of a man who has learned that panic uses more than it earns. When I lowered myself onto the bench, his head turned slightly in my direction. "Excuse me," he called across the gap between us. "Are you waiting for the 26? "Yes, sir," I said. "Would you mind telling me when it arrives? My ride is running late, and I would rather not wave down the wrong bus." "I will let you know," I said. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Cars passed. The heat shimmered above the asphalt the way it does when the day has stopped pretending to be comfortable. I stared at the road and tried not to count how many hours it had been since I had a room I could call mine. Then the man said quietly, "You sound like a man having a hard day." I almost laughed, not from amusement, from the strange relief of someone naming the thing. "Sir," I said, "you do not know the half of it." He turned his face toward me, though his eyes did not land on mine the way a sighted man's would. "What happened?" I should have stayed quiet. A 68-year-old man does not usually confess his humiliation to a stranger at a bus stop in the middle of the afternoon. But there was something in his voice that made the truth feel less dangerous. Not pity. Not the polite curiosity of someone who would forget by evening. Something older than that. The kind of patience that has earned itself. So I told him. The short version. Garrett, Heather, the house in Roseville, the mortgage payments, the grandchildren, the apartment I had given up, the workbench I had let go of, and the $40 folded in my shirt pocket. When I finished, he did not say he was sorry. He said, "Sir, would you be willing to do something for me?" I wiped my palms on my pants. "Depends what it is." "My driver will be here in a few minutes. He was expecting my nephew from Spokane to arrive this morning. The nephew missed his flight." He paused. "I have a meeting this afternoon that I cannot walk into alone." "What kind of meeting?" "The kind with attorneys, senior partners, and people who smile while trying to take things that do not belong to them." Something in that sentence found a door in me I did not know was still open. Then he said the words that changed the entire direction of my life. "I would like you to be my nephew for the afternoon." I stared across the street at him and waited for the joke to declare itself. It did not. "Sir," I said slowly, "you do not even know me." "No," he replied, But I know what abandonment sounds like, and I know what a decent man sounds like when he is trying not to cry in public. A black Lincoln turned the corner and pulled toward the curb across the street. "My name is Theodore Halbert," he said, "but people who know me call me Theo. Come with me, Harlan. I will explain everything in the car." The Lincoln's doors closed with the kind of soft, expensive sound that belongs to vehicles, maintained the way most people treat promises they actually intend to keep. The air inside smelled of leather and lemon polish, and the faint mustiness of old paper kept in warm rooms. The driver, a black gentleman close to my age in a dark suit, had taken my suitcase from me at the curb without asking a single question. His name, I learned later, was Russell. He had been Theo's driver for 19 years. He had the steady, unhurried quality of a man who had seen enough of life to know which parts deserved hurrying. Theo folded his cane across his lap and turned his face toward me. "Harlan," he said, "you deserve to know why I asked." I looked at him carefully. He was 76, I guessed, the kind of 76 that comes from taking care of yourself for most of your life, and then letting grief and work take the rest. His hands were large and steady on his knees. "When I was 34, he said, "I had a wife, a newborn daughter, and a cardiology practice that was barely breathing. My business partner stole $80,000 from our operating account and disappeared the same week payroll was due. I sat on a curb on 28th Street, trying to figure out how to tell a waiting room full of nurses and young residents that I had failed them." His voice did not shake, but something lived inside it that had not quite finished grieving. A retired plumber found me there. White hair, work boots, the kind of hands that know what real work feels like. His name was Cornelius Bray. He took me to a coffee shop, sat with me for 2 hours, and then wrote me a personal check for $10,000. A stranger. I stared at him. A stranger did that. "A stranger saved my practice," Theo said. "I paid him back 6 months later, but the debt I carried was not money." He turned toward the window, where Sacramento was moving past in late afternoon light. "For 40 years I have been waiting for the right moment, the right person." He paused. "Today, Harlan, I found you sitting on his curb." The law office occupied the 17th floor of a glass building on Capitol Mall. The kind of space where the furniture has been selected to remind you of your own inadequacy, where the silence itself costs money, and where people have learned to say very little while meaning a great deal. Russell parked by the curb and came around to take Theo's arm. He looked at me once, in the way a man looks at someone he has decided to trust provisionally, and said nothing. In the elevator, Theo adjusted his tie and rested one hand lightly on my sleeve. "You are my nephew from Spokane," he said quietly. "You do not need to explain much. Just sit beside me and let them wonder." "Wonder what?" "Whether I am as alone as they hoped." That sentence stayed in my chest all the way down the long carpeted hallway. When the conference room doors opened, 6 people turned to look at us. 3 attorneys in dark suits, 2 doctors who were senior partners in Theo's cardiology practice, and a woman in a cream-colored jacket, blonde hair tucked behind her ears, with the composed smile of someone who has been practicing it since before the meeting was scheduled. Theo introduced her as Malene, his late brother's wife. Her smile tightened the moment she heard my name. "Harlan," she repeated, "I thought your nephew was Bradley." Theo did not miss a beat. "Bradley is my brother's son. Harlan is on my late wife's side. He came because I asked him to." Malene's eyes moved across my worn shirt, my scuffed shoes, and the old man's hand resting on my sleeve. She knew I did not belong in that room. She simply had not yet worked out why I was there. I sat beside Theo at the long glass table and said nothing. For the first time since morning, my silence felt less like shame and more like something useful. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. I understood about half of what was said. Trust transfers, foundation assets, succession authority, irrevocable structures, words that sounded clean on the surface but had teeth underneath if you listened past the vocabulary. What I understood clearly was Meline. She kept saying family the way Garrett had said it, soft enough to sound like love, weighted enough to become a claim. Every sentence she directed at Theo began with something reasonable and ended with something that moved a number slightly in her direction. At one point, she folded her hands on the table and said, "Theodore, I only think it is fair that certain assets remain available for family needs." Theo tilted his head. "Which family needs, Meline?" The room went quiet. She blinked. "Future care, expenses, stability." Whose stability? Nobody moved. The attorneys looked at their papers. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Then Meline's eyes shifted to me. "I have to admit," she said carefully, "I am uncomfortable discussing private matters with extended family present." Theo's hand tightened once on my sleeve. Not much, just enough. "Harlan came because I asked him to," he said. "He is here because I trust him." If the presence of family makes you uncomfortable, Meline, perhaps you should ask yourself why you are in this room. That was the first time I saw her smile break. No papers were signed, no commitments were made. But when we walked out, I understood exactly what Theo had needed. Not a lawyer, not another doctor, not someone who could counter her arguments point by point. He had needed a witness. He had needed a face she could not categorize or dismiss, sitting quietly beside him in a room where she had expected to find him alone. Sometimes that is enough to make a greedy person hesitate. In the elevator going down, Theo did not speak for a long moment. Then he found my sleeve and gave it one firm squeeze. Not the grip of a man who needs help. The grip of a man communicating something without words, the way people do when words would make it smaller. Russell was waiting at the curb with the Lincoln running. When we got inside, Theo leaned back against the leather seat and exhaled the way a man does after something has been held tightly for too long. "Thank you, Harlan." I looked at him. "I didn't do anything." "You sat beside me," he said. "You let them see a face they couldn't place. That was enough." I looked out the window as the city moved past. Office buildings, older streets, houses with deep porches and lawns cared for by people who intended to stay. My stomach tightened when I remembered I still did not know where I was sleeping that night. Theo seemed to hear the thought. "You will come home with me," he said. I turned toward him. "Theo, I need to be honest. I have $40. I cannot pay you. I don't know how long it will be before I can leave. And I will not become another burden in someone else's house." His face softened. "Harlan," he said, "a burden is something carried without love. A guest is someone invited." Russell turned onto a quiet street lined with old trees. The Lincoln pulled into the driveway of a 1923 Craftsman with warm porch lights and a lemon tree visible beyond the side gate. Inside, the house smelled like cedar and coffee and old records. The guest room had a quilt folded at the foot of the bed and a window that looked out onto the back garden. I set Eleanor's photograph on the nightstand. For the first time since morning, I was not sitting on a bench. I was under a roof. The next morning, I woke before sunrise because old habits do not ask permission. For a few minutes, I lay still, listening to a quiet house that was not mine. No children running down the hallway. No Heather sighing in the kitchen because I had left something on the counter. No Garrett scrolling through his phone at breakfast and calling it conversation. Just the ticking of a clock somewhere downstairs and the faint sound of wind in the lemon tree. I got dressed, carried Eleanor's photograph to the dresser, and went down to the kitchen. Theo was already at the table, one hand resting beside a white mug. Russell was near the window with the newspaper, and his reading glasses low on his nose. Neither of them said anything about the timing. Nobody asked me to explain anything. "You eat eggs?" I asked. Russell looked up. Theo smiled. "Every morning," he said, "if someone is kind enough to make them." So I made eggs, toast, bacon, and coffee, and when I set Theo's plate in front of him, I said, "Eggs at 6 o'clock, toast on the right, bacon at the top." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and said, "Thank you." That was how it started. I fixed a loose cabinet hinge that afternoon, tightened the wobbling leg on the old workbench in the basement the next day, cleaned leaves from the gutters the day after that. I was not trying to earn my room. I was trying to remember I still had something to give. On the third day, I called Garrett from the kitchen phone. It went straight to voicemail. I stood beside the old coffee maker and listened to my son's recorded voice asking me to leave a message, and for a moment, I forgot what I had planned to say. "Garrett," I finally said, "it's Pop. I'm all right. I found a place to stay. I just wanted you to know I'm safe." I gave him Theo's number. I waited that evening, then the next morning, then the next night. No call, no text, not even the address of that senior facility on Watt Avenue he had promised to send. The silence told me everything I had not wanted to know. And here, before I tell you what happened next, I want to stop for just a moment. If this story has already landed somewhere close to home for you, please subscribe. Stories like this exist because betrayal is not rare, and neither is the grace that sometimes follows it. Now let me tell you what Theo asked of me 8 mornings after I arrived. He asked me to sit with him at the kitchen table after breakfast. Russell had gone to take the Lincoln for an oil change. The house was quiet except for the clock above the stove. "Harlan," he said, resting both palms flat on the table, "I want to talk to you about the foundation." He was 76. His heart had the kind of history that shows up in a man's pace and the way he sits down before he is tired. The practice would eventually be sold to a hospital group he trusted. Most of the proceeds would go into the charitable foundation he had created in 2015. That foundation pays for cardiac care for uninsured patients across 5 counties, he said. Children, retired people, working parents who make too much to qualify for help and too little to survive a hospital bill. He turned his blind eyes toward me. It needs a board that remembers why it exists. Not more doctors, not more attorneys. One ordinary decent man who can sit in a room every quarter and ask whether we are still doing what we said we would do. I looked at him for a long moment. "Theo," I said, "I am a retired electrician." "That," he answered quietly, "is exactly why I am asking you." I said yes. I told myself I would stay only until I found somewhere else. A week, 2. Long enough to get steady, find a room I could afford, and stop feeling like I was standing inside someone else's life. But weeks became months. Months became a year. And without anyone making a speech about it, I became part of the house. I learned exactly how Theo liked his coffee. Strong, no sugar. 1 small splash of cream added before the mug reached him. He learned that I needed a few quiet minutes in the morning before I was ready to talk. We ate breakfast at the same table every day. At night, I read to him in the living room while the old record player turned beside us. We finished a biography of Lincoln, then a book about the Transcontinental Railroad. Sometimes he would stop me in the middle of a paragraph and say, "Read that part again," not because he had missed it, but because the words had found some old place inside him. And he wanted to be sure. I drove him to doctor appointments, board meetings, and the cemetery in Fair Oaks where his wife and daughter were buried side by side beneath a shared stone. At the graves, he placed one hand on each headstone and stood without speaking. I never interrupted. Grief that old does not need advice. It only needs someone willing to stand close enough to matter. 3 years and 4 months passed that way. But peace is not the same as safety. And I want you to understand that the story did not become quiet simply because my life had. Malene's name kept appearing at the edges. A letter here, a legal question there, an attempt to reopen a door Theo had already locked. The foundation board was her real target. The consulting fees on the quarterly reports kept climbing in ways that did not match the work being done. In my third year, I noticed the number had gone up again, then again. At the third meeting where it appeared, I tapped the page with one finger and said, "I'm sorry, but why does this number keep rising when the patient outreach budget has not moved?" The room got quiet. The auditor looked at me longer than usual. 2 weeks later, the truth came out. The foundation's chief financial officer had been directing money to a consulting firm owned by his brother-in-law. Not enough to make headlines, but enough to poison the work quietly, the way corruption usually does. He was removed. The controls were strengthened. The money was recovered. I did not save the foundation by myself. That is not how it happened, and I am not going to dress it up that way. But I asked the question, and sometimes asking the question is how the truth gets permission to enter the room. Theo passed on a Tuesday morning in March. There was no dramatic warning, no final speech. He went to sleep under the blue quilt his wife had chosen before her hands began to shake, and he did not wake up. Russell found him. I was in the canned soup aisle of the grocery store when my phone rang and I saw Russell's name on the screen. He did not have to say much. His voice broke on my name, and I left the cart where it stood and drove straight home. The house looked exactly the same when I arrived. That was the hard part. The lemon tree was moving in the wind. The porch light was still on. The Coltrane album was still resting beside the record player because Theo had asked if we could listen after breakfast. The next morning, I went upstairs and sat on the edge of his bed. Russell stood in the doorway with one hand over his mouth, trying to be steady the way he had been steady for 19 years. I took Theo's hand. It was already cooler than it should have been, but it was still his hand. The same hand that had found my sleeve in the law office. The same hand that had rested on his daughter's headstone. The same hand that had trusted me when my own son had decided I was something to leave behind. I said something to him then that I will not repeat here. Some things belong only to the people involved, and to the silence that comes after. The estate settled over 4 months. I learned that Theo had planned his, leaving the way he planned everything, quietly, carefully, and with no room for wrong hands to move the furniture after he was gone.
The practice was sold to the hospital group he trusted. The foundation received the bulk of the proceeds. Russell received the house, because Theo believed a man who had guarded a home for 19 years should not be treated like hired help when the owner died. Yolanda, who came 3 times a week and had kept the house running for a decade, received a pension generous enough to keep her safe for the rest of her life.
I received a letter. Not a fortune, not a property, a letter. Dictated in 2023, sealed, and left with instructions to give it to me after everything else had settled. I read it alone at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. By the second paragraph, I had to take off my glasses. By the last line, I understood that Theo had not left me money. He had left me proof. Proof that when my own blood had decided I was finished, a stranger had looked across a street and seen something worth saving. Along with the letter came a lifetime seat on the foundation board and a modest stipend. Not a fortune, not a mansion, enough to make my life easier without changing who I was. That was all I needed. Garrett came back on the morning Theo's will was read. Not before. Not once in the 3 years I had lived in that house. Not at Christmas. Not on my birthday. Not even a card when Theo's obituary ran with my name in it as a member of the foundation board. But that Wednesday morning, when an old man's estate was being settled, and there was a chance money might be attached to my name, my son suddenly remembered where to find me. I walked out of the conference room on Capitol Mall with Theo's letter folded inside my jacket and saw Garrett through the glass wall of the waiting area. He was standing beside Heather. He had on a suit I did not recognize. She sat with her purse on her lap, and her legs crossed, and an expression arranged carefully into something that resembled concern. Garrett stood when he saw me. "Pop," he said quietly, "I heard about your friend. I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. "Are you?" His mouth opened, then closed. Heather leaned forward. "Mr. Pruitt, we just thought, with everything that happened, it might be time to reconnect. We're family." There it was again. Family. The same word that had paid for Garrett's mortgage. The same word that had cost me my apartment, my truck, and my workbench. The same word that had been abandoned outside a Denny's on my birthday with $40 in its pocket. I sat down across from them, not because I was weak, but because I wanted my voice steady, and I wanted witnesses to hear it clearly. "Tell me the truth," I said. "Did you come here for me? Or did you come because you heard a wealthy man's name attached to mine?" Garrett looked down at his shoes. That was the only answer I needed. At the reception desk, the typing stopped for 1 second. Heather's face changed, not from guilt, but from the realization that everyone in that quiet room had understood the truth before she could arrange her expression around it. I kept my hands folded on my knees. "Garrett," I said, "you will always be my son. I loved you when you were born. I loved you when you were broke and couldn't look me in the eye when you asked for help. I loved you when I gave up everything I had built because you said I was family." His jaw tightened. But family is not just blood. Family is who shows up. Family is who stays when you become inconvenient. Family is who calls back after leaving an old man on a bench on his birthday. Heather shifted in her chair. "That isn't fair. We were under pressure." I turned to her. "Pressure doesn't make a person abandon someone, Heather. It only shows you what they were already willing to abandon." She said nothing. I looked back at my son. "You made your choice 3 years ago, outside that Denny's. I am not here to punish you for it. I am not here to beg you to regret it. But I will not pretend nothing happened because you heard a wealthy man's name next to mine." He whispered, "Pop, I don't know what to say." I nodded slowly. "Then don't say anything. Just remember this when your daughters are grown. One day, they will learn how you treated their grandfather, and you will have to decide what you want that story to be." For a long moment, Garrett looked like something had come loose behind his eyes. Not the polished, rehearsed version of him that had walked in carrying whatever he had expected to receive. Something younger and less certain. Something that remembered being the child I had driven to school, coached through homework, helped bury his first dog in the backyard on a Saturday in November. "Pop," he said, "I didn't come here just for that." I held his eyes. "Maybe not just for that," I said, "but it is why you came today instead of any day in the last 3 years." He did not deny it. So I told him the truth, plainly and without drama, because I did not want mystery-feeding hope that had no honest foundation. Theo did not leave me a fortune. The house belongs to Russell. The practice was sold, and the proceeds went to the foundation exactly as Theo planned. Yolanda has a pension. I have a seat on the board, a modest stipend, and a letter from a man who understood what loyalty meant. Heather's expression tightened. "So there is nothing." I looked at her. "There is cardiac care for uninsured patients across 5 counties. There are children who will have surgeries their parents could never afford. There are retired people who will not have to choose between medicine and groceries this winter. There is a foundation that will outlive all of us if we protect it." I let that settle. But if you are asking whether there is money for you, the answer is no. Garrett leaned back slowly. He looked like the chair was the only thing between him and something he was not ready to sit with. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Theo gave me something better than money, I said. He gave me a place to stand after my own son left me sitting on a bench. That is not something I can divide, transfer, or hand over because you finally remembered I exist. Garrett whispered, "I'm sorry, Pop." I nodded once. I hope someday you mean that for the right reason. I left them sitting in that waiting room. Russell was downstairs at the curb with the Lincoln running. When I got in, he looked at me through the rearview mirror. "You all right, Harlan?" I looked out at Capitol Mall, the glass buildings, the people moving fast through the afternoon, carrying coffee cups and leather folders, the city going about its business the way cities do, when something significant has just happened to someone they will never know. "I'm all right," I said. And I meant it. Not because it did not hurt. A father does not stop loving his son because his son becomes difficult to recognize. Love does not work that cleanly. It stays. It aches. It asks questions at 3 a.m. But that day, standing in that waiting room, I finally understood something I should have learned decades earlier. Blood makes people related. It does not make them loyal. Family is the man who hears pain in a stranger's voice and does not look away. Family is the waitress who brings coffee and pie before asking for anything in return. Family is the driver who handles your suitcase with care so you do not have to feel small. Family is the blind man who trusts your silence in a room full of people trying to take what is not theirs. Garrett was my son. Theo was my family. And as Russell pulled away from the curb, I finally knew the difference all the way down. I live in the house in the Fab 40s now. Russell says it is too big for one man, and he is probably right. The halls still hold Theo's footsteps. The living room still feels like it is waiting for a voice to ask for another record. Sometimes in the afternoon, when the light comes through the windows at a particular angle, I look toward his chair and half expect to see his hand resting on the arm of it, fingers tapping gently to something only he could feel. But the house is not empty. Yolanda still comes 3 days a week. Russell and I eat breakfast together most mornings. The lemon tree still needs pruning every fall. The old coffee maker still works, though I have threatened to replace it 6 times. At night, I read in the living room, sometimes out loud, not because anyone asked me to, but because the house seems to remember Theo better when words are moving through it. I keep Eleanor's photograph on the dresser. I keep Theo's letter in the inside pocket of my jacket. I have read it more times than I can count, and each time the last line lands a little differently. He wrote, "Harlan, the world is full of benches. Sit on them when you have to. Get up when you can. And when you see somebody else sitting, remember what it cost you." I think about Garrett too. I will not pretend otherwise. I sent him a Christmas card last year. He did not send one back. My granddaughters are older now, and I do not know what they remember of me. That wound is still there. Some wounds do not close just because the life around them grows kinder. So this is not a perfect ending, but it is a true one. I have a roof. I have work that matters. I have people who notice when I go quiet too long. And after the morning I was left on that bench with a suitcase and $40. That feels like more grace than I ever had the right to expect. The bench is not always outside a Denny's. Sometimes it is a hospital waiting room. Sometimes it is a quiet house after a divorce, or a kitchen table where the phone stopped ringing. It is any place where someone who was supposed to love you made you feel like a problem they were done solving. And when you are there, it feels final. It feels like the story has already decided your worth. It has not. That place is only a pause, a hard one, a lonely one, but still a pause. The story changes when you stand up, when someone brings you coffee before asking anything of you, when a man across the street hears something in your voice and chooses not to look the other way. And someday, if you keep living, you will see someone else sitting where you once sat. When that day comes, do not look away. Do the thing. That is the whole lesson Theo left me. That is the whole religion. If this story moved you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Would you have stayed quiet and waited the way I did? Or would you have confronted your son the moment he drove away? There is no wrong answer, only the honest one. And if you believe that betrayal always reveals the truth eventually, and that kindness given to a stranger has a way of coming back around, please subscribe for more stories about family, loyalty, and the quiet kind of justice that arrives when people finally understand what they threw away.